Hi, I'm Steve Kozak, and welcome to Fundamentals of Flash Photography. Of all the classes I've ever taught, I know this is probably the most difficult. It's actually not even a very fun class to take, but it's such an important class for photographers to learn the information that I'm going to present. Now, part of what I'm going to teach you is very sound, fundamental science of flash photography, but then I'm going to teach you some of the little shortcuts and methods that I have developed in order to gain complete control over this flash. And that's what's most important to me, is controlling the output of the flash. I need to know every time this fires exactly how much light is coming out of it. And I don't have that when I shoot an ETTL or in program. If we could go back in time to the old Vivitar 283s and Vivitar 285s, those were fully manual flashes. They had some automatic features, but certainly you were able to shoot them in a fully manual mode. Well, today's modern flash can also be used completely manual, but for most photographers, I think they try to get away with using it in ETTL or TTL, and that's where we're having issues with our flash exposures because they're just simply out of control. The camera and the flash are working together to try to determine an exposure, and rarely is it as accurate as we professionals need it to be. By shooting these flashes in manual mode, we take complete control over the output of the flash, and we know each and every time exactly what we're going to get. For me, it's the consistency of the output that lets me shoot this reliably and with complete control every single time. Now, one of the things that's going to make this a little bit difficult is that I know there are some Nikon shooters as well as Canon shooters out there. I happen to be a Canon shooter, so the flash that I'm going to be using is the Canon 580EX or the 580EX2. Most of you Nikon shooters will be using the Nikon SB800 or the new Nikon SB900. Now, I'm going to show you how to get through some of the menu options on my flash, and for you Nikon shooters, you're going to have to refer to your instruction book in order to find how to make those changes on your flash. Everything I'm going to talk about works for both Nikon and Canon flash, or any of the other brands for that matter, but I'm not going to be able to show each and every menu for each and every type of flash, so I'm going to rely on you to use your own instruction book. Might be a good idea to even pause this DVD and go grab that right quick so that you'll have it when we get to those menu settings. Let's begin just with a couple of ideas about light in general. First of all, let's agree that light falls off. In other words, the closer you are to the light source, the brighter it is. We know that to be true. We can take a look at car headlights. If you're driving down the highway, isn't it a lot brighter nearer the car than it is, say, several hundred feet down the road? That's because light falls off. It's not as bright the further away you get from it. That's also true of flash, and that's what makes flash photography a little bit difficult, is that the exposure changes as the distance between the camera and the subject changes. So in manual photography, manual flash photography, we're constantly having to make some adjustments to our f-stops to compensate for that loss of light as the subject moves further away, or that increase in intensity as the subject is closer to us. Now, when it comes to flash, the power of that flash is rated in what is called a guide number. The guide number is like the wattage or the horsepower of that flash. That's one way of rating how powerful that flash will be. And there's some difficulty sometimes in comparing apples to apples when you look at a flash's guide number, because they're not always expressed exactly the same. Typically speaking, the guide number is expressed at 10 feet at 100 ISO. Now, it's not important that you know that, but it is important that you realize if you're looking at a guide number that is at 10 feet at 100 ISO and you're comparing it to another flash whose guide number is expressed at, say, 400 ISO, you're going to have a discrepancy in the power. It's going to look like one is more powerful than the other, when in fact it may not be at all. So really and truly, if we could have an industry standard that guide number would be expressed at 10 feet at 100 ISO. Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that our guide number is 110. Now, I realize we don't know what that means just yet, but let's just say 110 is the horsepower or the power of our flash. We have a little rule that lets us determine what the f-stop is going to be based upon distance and guide number. And that equation is guide number divided by distance equals f-stop. So here's how it works. If your guide number is 110 and your subject is 10 feet away, you would divide 10 into 110 to get the f-stop. And so, doing some simple math, 110 divided by 10 equals 11, which would be f11. So that makes flash photography fairly simple. Guide number divided by distance equals f-stop. Take any distance, regardless of what that distance is, so long as you're shooting 100 ISO, and so long as your guide number is 110, your exposures will be dead on. So let's do this a couple of times. Let's take a look at what happens if we're 20 feet away. If our guide number is 110 and we divide that by 20 feet, the net result is going to round off to f5.6. If you're, say, 5 feet away from your subject and we divide 110 by 5 feet, the net result would be 22. So we know that at 5 feet, the exposure is going to be f22. Now, again, this might seem a little bit complicated at first, but work with this equation, kind of play it through in your mind, and just get used to the idea of what's happening. The closer you are to your subject, let's say 5 feet, the smaller lens opening you need, like an f22, because it's going to be a very bright exposure at 5 feet. At 10 feet, the exposure is f11. At 20 feet, the exposure is 5.6. So we're having to open up the lens to compensate for the loss of light, to allow more light to hit the sensor. And that's because that distance has increased so much. Interestingly enough, the shutter speed is going to be a given. And the shutter speed is really determined by your camera's flash sync. And what that simply means is that your camera is designed to synchronize with your flash at a particular speed. And the mechanics of what has to happen is pretty fascinating. And just to give you a real simple description, what has to happen is that that shutter has to come completely open before the flash is allowed to fire. If it does not completely open, that shutter will be covering the sensor, which will yield just black on your image because the shutter did not get out of the way. Most digital cameras will sync at around 200. Some will sync faster than that. But for our purposes, as we're really beginning to control our flash and learn how to use our flash, I'm just going to say for now that all flash exposures will be at 1/125th of a second. So just take that for what it's worth. We'll learn some other techniques a little bit later on, but for right now, we'll just always assume that 125 is going to be the shutter speed. So at 10 feet, with a guide number of 110 at 100 ISO, we'll divide 10 into 110. That would give us an exposure of f11 at 125. Now, everything that I've just talked about assumes that you're using your camera in manual and your flash in manual. So what you're going to want to do is come to the mode button and press that mode button until the readout reads M or manual. Another important setting when using your flash in manual mode is this little ratio setting. You want to make sure that when we start out, that ratio is set as 1:1. For the next setting on the flash, we're going to need to attach the flash to the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on. The setting that I'm interested in is this zoom head position, and that's going to be reading out right here on the display. What happens with the zoom head on your flash is that it tracks your zoom as you zoom in and out. So for example, it reads right there 28 millimeters. If I zoom my lens in, notice how that reading changes to match where I've zoomed. Now it's at 70 millimeters, and it will track everywhere that I zoom. Well, that's a problem, and that's a feature we're going to need to turn off. So what we're going to do is press this zoom button, and what we want to read is manual zoom. So with it blinking, I can now turn the dial, and notice how this little M shows up right there before the word zoom. Now I'm in manual mode, and we're going to want to set that to the 35 millimeter position in manual zoom mode. I'm going to turn the flash around and show you the front just with this back in automatic so that you can see what's going on inside the flash. Notice as I zoom, the little head inside the flash is moving in and out, moving forward and backward. We can't have that happening with our manual exposure, because what that's doing is that's focusing the beam of light much like a focusable flashlight does. If you've ever played with one of those focusable flashlights, the wider that beam is, of course, the more coverage it has, but the less bright it is. When you focus that light, it makes a much smaller spot on the surface that you're shining it, and the light gets a lot more intense in that smaller area. Well, for our flash photographs, we cannot have our exposure changing just because we're zooming the lens in and out. We need a consistent exposure each and every time that flash fires. So that's why I've chosen to come back here to the zoom head and turn that automatic feature off. I'm going to the manual settings and making that rest at the 35 millimeter position. There's a reason I've done that. I'll kind of explain that here in just a bit, but this is how we're going to do it, and it's kind of my own little method of overcoming the automatic features of this flash. So let's review. To begin with our flash photography in manual mode, you want to make sure that your flash is set to manual mode, the ratio is set 1:1, and the zoom head position is in manual mode at 35 millimeter. So with our flash properly set and our camera in manual mode, we go back to our guide number formula, where guide number divided by distance equals the f-stop, and we know to set the camera based on that distance. So at 10 feet into 110, the exposure is f11, and the given shutter speed is going to be 125. Now I've predetermined our guide number to be 110 at 100 ISO, and I've got this information by using the specs of both the Nikon and Canon flashes. What I've done is I've set this zoom head to a fixed position at 35 millimeters. The truth is, when that flash head is zooming in and out, the guide number changes for every setting based upon where your zoom is. So, for example, if we have our zoom set at 28 millimeters and the flash is tracking that zoom, that has a different guide number than it would be when we zoom to 35 millimeters or to 50 millimeters. Every position on that zoom represents a different guide number. And for our purposes, we want this guide number to be something that we've memorized. And the fact that we're turning that zoom head off means we don't have to memorize all of these guide numbers. We just have to remember the one for that 35 millimeter position. You know, really it's as simple as calculating the f-stop at 10 feet as being f11. And we're just going to assume from now on, for the rest of our photographic life, that 10 feet is f11. We can also assume that 20 feet is always going to be 5.6 and that 5 feet is always going to be f22. But you're not always going to be taking every single image at 5 feet, 10 feet, or 20 feet. You might sometimes be 7 feet, or you might sometimes want to be 15 feet. Well, you could simply do the math by dividing 15 into 110 to get f8. You could also divide 7 into 110 to get f16. Now I know I'm doing that math really quick, But the truth of the matter is I'm really not doing math at all. I have simply memorized that 10 feet is F11. 10 feet is always going to be F11 when you set your flash up the way we've set it up, and your guide number is 110. So without doing any math, I can simply know 10 feet is F11, 7 feet is F16, 5 feet is F22. Going the other direction, 10 feet is F11, 15 feet is F8, and 20 feet is 5/6. Now, don't let that overwhelm you. For now, simply do the math. Now here's the deal. I don't like math any more than you do. But the fact is, the math is what's making this work. But we also have the law of physics on our side here with something called the inverse square law. It tells us that with any given distance, if we cut that distance in half, we gain 2 stops. Conversely, if we take any given distance and double that distance, we lose 2 stops. Now this can be proven out in doing the math, and let's talk about this for a moment, because we know 10 feet is always what? F11. I've told you that 5 feet is 22, and if we count f-stops, if we go from F11 to 16 to 22, that's a 2-stop difference, 11, 16, and 22. The inverse square law says if we take any given distance and cut it in half, we gain 2 stops. Well, that's exactly what happens mathematically. If I know 10 feet is F11 and I cut that distance in half to 5 feet, I know that I'm going to gain 2 stops. So F11, 16, 22. Looking at it from the flip side, the inverse square law says if we take any given distance and double it, we lose 2 stops. And that also proves out mathematically, because 10 feet is always what? F11. 20 feet we've said was 5/6. Well, let's count it. F11, F8, 5/6. There's our 2 stops. So without doing any math whatsoever, we could simply follow the inverse square law and say 10 feet is F11, 20 feet is 5.6, 10 feet is F11, 5 feet is F22. So I want to run through your checklist one more time. Remember that we're going to start with our camera in manual mode. We're also going to have our flash set to manual mode. But in addition, we want to make sure that the ratio setting on our flash is set at 1:1, and we want to make sure that the zoom head position on the flash is in manual mode at 35 millimeters. If we've done this with the Canon 580EX and the Nikon SB800s and SB900s, the guide number is going to be 110 for our purposes. And we're going to take this guide number of 110, divide our camera or the flash to subject distance into that guide number to get a resulting f-stop. So at 10 feet divided into 110 gives us 11, which gives us an exposure of f11, and the shutter speed for our purposes right now is always going to be 125. Now, as complicated as this may seem at this point, it's really pretty simple. Things are about to get a little bit more complicated for sure as we go through and really dig into some of the mechanics of operating our flash in manual. But it's real important that you have this part of it well within your grasp. If you don't, I would invite you to pause the DVD and just work on these concepts before you continue on to the next chapter. Let me just say this too, a little trick in shooting in manual mode. If we've determined that 10 feet is f11, all you've got to do is set your camera to f11 at 125. If we know that the inverse square law tells us moving in half that distance, let's say to 5 feet, causes us to gain 2 stops, we could step up to 5 feet and change our camera settings to f22. The inverse square law also tells us if we double the distance let's say from 10 feet to 20 feet, that we're going to lose 2 stops. So we could set our camera from f11 to 5.6 when we back up to 20 feet. But the fact of the matter is, I don't really make those types of calculations too very often. The trick here is to try to work the distance as consistently as possible when you're using a flash, let's say at a reception. At the reception, I'm trying to maintain my 10 feet status, and I'm doing my close-ups and my wide-angle shots simply by zooming the lens in and out. I'm trying to avoid backing up too much or stepping in too close. I'm simply trying to maintain my 10 feet distance. Of course, if I have to change that distance, I know I can change the exposure. But the fact is, at 10 feet, I can take really tight close-ups by zooming the lens out. I can take wide-angle shots by zooming it back and getting large groups of people, but my camera-to-subject distance doesn't change at all. Perhaps the hardest part of all of flash photography is simply trying to calculate really how far 10 feet is. Well, it's not uncommon for you to find me working and looking at the floor or looking up at the ceiling, because what I'm actually doing is counting the tiles. A lot of floors have 1 by 1 tiles, so I can simply count my 10 tiles and I know where my 10 feet is. A lot of the ceiling tiles that have the drop-down ceilings, those tiles are 2 by 4. So I'll just try to count those tiles to get my 10 feet distance. I want to show you my setup when I'm using my flash on board the camera. It's actually not sitting on the camera itself. I have the flash on a bracket. Now this is important for a couple of reasons. One, getting the flash up higher eliminates that problem of red eye that you sometimes see. That happens when the flash is too close to the lens. So getting it on a bracket and raising it up above the lens will eliminate that problem from happening. The other thing getting the flash up higher does for you is it pushes the shadows downward, so that if you do happen to photograph someone near a wall or too close to something in the background, you don't see the shadows outlining the subject because the flash is coming from up above. Those shadows are being forced down behind the subject. So that's really helpful. The other thing about doing this on a bracket is if you turn your camera to do vertical shots, even if the flash is sitting on the camera, it's now off to the side of the lens, and that's going to throw shadows off to the right-hand side as you take your photographs. By using a bracket that flips, you can simply flip the bracket and the flash up to the top so that now the flash is still directly above the lens. Let's take our flash photography up one notch and talk about using it in a more professional manner. If we talk about the quality of flash photography, anytime you're using the flash on the camera, it's generally pretty harsh and pretty flat because it's coming in so frontal. Professional photographers like to work more with directional lighting and raking light because it's this directional light that creates texture and detail as it rakes across the body. The way we're going to accomplish that is to get the flash off the camera and onto a stand. With the flash on the stand, suddenly things get a lot more interesting and really a lot easier. In order to work with the flash on a stand, we're going to have some way of firing it by remote control. You can connect it with a long cord, but that's going to be cumbersome and will more than likely cause you to knock your stand over. I'm using the Pocket Wizard transmitters and receivers. The receiver is attached to a little hot shoe that the flash is actually connected to, and I've got the hot shoe connected to a simple umbrella stand adapter. This simple, inexpensive adapter will allow you to mount your flash to any standard stand and also be able to add some sort of softbox or umbrella attachment. On my camera, I have the remote control transmitter so that anytime I fire my camera, the flash is going to fire via remote control. So here's the real beauty of working with a flash on a stand, is that once you've placed the flash, you're free to move around anywhere you want to. For example, let's say we move our flash to here at 10 feet. We know the exposure is going to be f11 because the flash to subject distance is 10 feet. But with my camera firing the flash through remote control, I'm free to move wherever I want to. I can get as far away or as close to the subject as I want because the flash to subject distance doesn't change. I'm going to be at f11 regardless of where I stand. I can use my telephoto lens, I can use my wide angle lens, and the exposure never changes. And obviously I don't have quite the room here, but if I needed to pick up an additional f-stop, I could simply cut that distance in half, let's say to 5 feet, and now I'm at f22. I'm, again, free to move wherever I want to because the distance between the flash and the subject is not going to change. There may be an advantage to working with the flash in a little closer to the subject, and that's what I want to talk about next. So far, we've spent a lot of time talking about the quantity of light or trying to determine the exposure of our flash, but we've not really mentioned the quality of light. The quality of the light has to do with how harsh or how soft the light is, and of course for most portrait photographs we tend to work with a softer lighting. Well, anytime we're using our portable flash, it's going to present a fairly harsh light because the quality of light is determined by the size of the light source. Now, a lot of people think it's harsh because it's working in so close or far away, and that's not really the case at all. Harshness is the result of working with a light source that is rather small. That's why in a regular studio environment we tend to work with umbrellas and softboxes to take our studio strobes that are fairly small and make them a larger light source, which makes them in the end softer or more diffused. So when you're working with your flash on a stand, there are a lot of attachments that you might want to consider to help soften that light by getting a bigger light source. One of those might be a softbox that can be attached easily to your stand and with your flash inside it, or you might even use an umbrella, which again takes this tiny little light source and turns it into a much larger light source. And it's this larger light source that's going to make that lighting a lot softer. Now, some of you have probably invested in these little attachments that fit right on the flash, and my question to you is, when I attach this to the flash, did I really change the size of the light source? And the answer, of course, is no, I did not. So really, this is not how this was designed to work. It's not really designed to be pointing straight at the subject because it's not going to make the light any softer because it's not making the light source any larger. So let's assume for now that I have some sort of a softbox attachment or an umbrella attached to my flash on a stand. It's important to realize that putting any type of lighting modifier on your flash is going to change the overall output of the flash. And we've just spent a large portion of time going over and over the fact that 10 feet is going to be f11. Well, once you attach some sort of lighting modifier, that might not be the case. The lighting modifier that I use is a small softbox, and through my own testing I've found that it really doesn't take a lot of light away from using the flash without it. But it's real important for you guys to test the output of the light at 10 feet to really determine if you're getting a true f11 exposure with your flash 10 feet away while you're using that modifier. There's a couple of things that you could do. You could just work the light in closer when you're using your lighting modifier, but you also might consider moving the zoom head position from 35 millimeters to 50 millimeters because that is going to increase the power of the flash as that flash is more focused. So you may pick up the extra little punch that you need to get your f11 at 10 feet, but I just want to make sure that you are measuring that and not just relying on our calculations because again, that lighting modifier is going to absorb some of that light. But I'm going to assume for now that I've got my umbrella attached to the flash on the stand and working with it at 10 feet, if I'm getting f11, I still have a large light source, but the advantage of moving the flash in closer to the subject means that light source is actually becoming softer because overall the size of the light source as far as the subject is concerned is appearing larger. It looks bigger when it's 5 feet away than it does at 10 feet away. So there could be some strong advantages to using your flash in much closer than 10 feet. That, again, is why it's great to have it on a stand. There's no really set formula for me to tell you where to place the light, But I would say 5 feet, depending on how large of a group you're photographing and how much coverage you need, is a pretty good place to start as you begin testing some of these methods in your own work. Now, at 5 feet, the exposure we've learned is f/22. But if you think about it, f/22 may not be an ideal f-stop for us to be using. It could be that we're working in a location that's very dark or dimly lit, and photographing it at f/22 is going to simply make that location look sort of like photographing in a cave with no detail in the background. It may also be that it's to our advantage to work with a shallower depth of field, maybe around f4 or 5.6. So having our flash at 5 feet away and having an exposure of f/22 could kind of stifle our creativity, except that we actually can control the output of that flash in order to achieve a particular f-stop that we want. And that's what makes getting control of our flash so important. And what I'm about to show you now gives you the ultimate control over your flash and ultimate control over your lighting, which is what we as professional photographers want. So here's how we control the output of the flash. Basically, the flash has something of a built-in rheostat like you might see on a dimmer switch in your lights at home, where you can raise the illumination up or bring it down gradually. Well, we have that in our flash as well, and it's in the form of this little 1-to-1 ratio that we talked about a little earlier. That 1-to-1, it's not really a ratio, but it is a determination of the flash's overall output. And when we have it set at 1-to-1, we're getting the full benefit of the full power of the flash. So let's use our example of 10 feet at f11. Obviously, at 1-to-1, that's the full benefit of the full power of the flash. That's why we're getting f11. But if we were to cut that power in half, that would actually cut down the overall output of the flash by 1 stop. Because if we can go back to the very fundamentals of photography, remember that each f-stop represents either twice as much light allowed to hit the sensor or half as much light being allowed to hit the sensor. And what we're going to do here is we're going to cut the light in half, which means we're going to lose 1 stop. And I'm going to do that simply by pressing the button in the center, dialing the little wheel until I get it to move to the 1/2 setting. Now notice over on the side there's the +3 and the +7. You've got to be aware that that's showing up, and we don't want those in there. What we want is just the 1/2 power setting without any other fractions. Having it set like this takes the overall output power of the flash down by 1 stop. So at 10 feet, now instead of getting f11, since we're at 1/2 power, we're going to get f8. Pretty cool, huh? Well, what if we cut a half in half? How much is that? Well, half of a half is a fourth. So I can cut it down to a 1/4 power or a 1/4 power, and the net result is I've just taken the flash overall output down by 2 stops. So at 10 feet, instead of getting f11, I'm losing 2 stops. I'm going from 11 to 8 to 5/6. Well, I can cut a 1/4 in half again. That would give me an 1/8. And as I move to an 1/8, now instead of being at 5/6, I'm at f4. If I keep going, I can cut an 1/8 in half. That would be 1/16. That has me at 2.8. And I can keep going. It goes all the way down to 1/128th power. So you see I have a great deal of control of the overall output of the flash. Well, let's kind of start back over again for a moment and take it back to full power. In my example of trying to work with your flash in an umbrella from 5 feet away, I told you that it might be to your advantage to, let's say, work at f4. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to move our flash in from 10 feet to 5 feet. At full power, the overall output is f22. But now I'm going to start cutting that power down until I can eventually get to an f4. So here I go. 1-to-1 is f22 at 5 feet. 1/2 is F16, 1/4 is F11, 1/8 is F8, 1/16 is 5/6, 1/32 is F4. So now, with my flash 5 feet away, at 100 ISO, at 1/32 power, the overall output is F4, and the shutter speed, of course, we're still remaining at 125. I am now completely controlling the overall output of the flash so that I can balance my lighting with whatever environment I want to be in. Well, let's take a look at a typical fill flash situation. This is going to be when you're working outdoors and your background is brighter than your subject. Let's say, for example, maybe your subject's standing underneath a tree in some nice shade, but beyond that tree is a lot of full-on sunshine, a lot of brightly lit foliage or what have you. If we photograph with the exposure under the tree, then the background's going to blow out and all that detail is going to be lost. If we set the exposure for the background, then our subject who is standing underneath the tree is going to be way too dark. So the trick here is to balance our flash to the exposure of the background so that we can raise the illumination of the subject to be closer to the illumination of the background. Well, let's say, for example, we've measured our background full-on sunlight at f16 at 125. Our test here is to be able to get our flash to fire at around f11 or f16. Now, typically we don't balance the two. Typically, you want the illumination on the subject to be about one stop less than the illumination on the background. So with our background at f16, we really want the lighting on our subject to be around f11. Well, here's what we're going to do. We've measured the background f16 at 125. Let's say we move our flash in on a stand to 5 feet away and we're using an umbrella to try to create a softer light. Our goal here is going to be simply to get that flash to fire at f11 or one stop under the background. So at 5 feet, we've learned that the exposure is f22. All we've got to do now is come over to the flash and take the power down until we get an overall output of f11. So here's what we're going to do. We started out at f22 at 1 to 1. I'm going to take this overall output down to half, which gives me f16. That's moving from f22 to f16. If I cut that in half again to a fourth, that gives me the overall output of f11, which gives me the nice balance of lighting on the subject that I wanted to my background, which was at f16. Well, let's take a look at a little different circumstance where we might be using our flash on a stand on an interior shot with low light. A good example of that would be, let's say, photographing a bride inside the church. Typically speaking, the exposure inside the church is pretty low, probably around 2.8 at an 1/8 or 2.8 at a 15th, obviously depending on the church that you're working in. But here's how we would take our flash on a stand and use it in a situation like that. The first step is going to be to take an ambient light reading with your light meter. In other words, we want to measure and see what the lighting is within the interior of the church. So in my example, if we say it's 2.8 at 15, that's the goal. That's where we want to set the camera, is at 2.8 at 15 in order to properly expose this image that we're about to take. What we want to do is to get our flash to also fire at 2.8, and we've already learned how to do that basically, depending on the distance that we use to place the flash away from our subject. We would start at that given f-stop, let's say 10 feet at f11, then we would go through the controls of powering down the flash until we got a total overall output of 2.8. f11 is 1 to 1, f8 would be shot at a half, 5/6 would be at a fourth, f4 would be at an 1/8. So 2.8 would be at 1/16th power. So what we're saying here is at 1/16th power with the flash 10 feet away, we're going to have an output of 2.8. But remember, I've told you as a given that the shutter speed was always going to be 125. Well, the truth of the matter is that's not really true, because now we have a technique that we call dragging the shutter. And this is simply a way of slowing down the shutter in order to record the ambient light that's present during an exposure. What you might not realize is that the shutter speed has no bearing whatsoever on the exposure of the flash. That's because the flash duration is so short. It may be 1/3000th or 1/6000th of a second. It comes and goes rather quickly. So during an exposure of 1/125th of a second, if I could do this in slow motion for you, 1/125th of a second happens. When that shutter's open, that flash fires so quickly and disappears, and then the shutter closes. So the truth of the matter is the shutter does not have an impact on the exposure of the flash. It only impacts the ambient light or the constant light that's present in a room. So based on our meter readings of the church, which was 2.8 at 15, we can now take our shutter speed off of 1/125th of a second because we want to slow it down to raise the overall illumination of the church on the sensor. So by setting the camera at 2.8 at 15 and allowing the flash to fire at 1/16th power at 10 feet away, we're now delicately balancing the flash output with the ambient light of the church. Now, just like fill flash, it may be that you don't want the two identically balanced. You might not want them both reading exactly the same. And what I find is for most of my interior work, I can control the relative brightness or dimness of the background with that shutter speed, because the flash is going to be the main light. It's going at 2.8 and the camera set at 2.8. That's going to fire, and that exposure is going to be right on for the subject as we're photographing our bride. But if we want the church to appear just a little bit darker than the bride, which is probably a good thing, we can simply take that shutter speed down from a 15th to 1/30th of a second, which is going to slightly underexpose that background to make it appear just a little bit darker than the bride, which is an ideal situation. So once again, it's important to remember that the shutter speed does not have any bearing on the exposure of the flash. You can use a shutter speed, any speed slower than the sync speed, and still fire your flash. Think about this. You could be in a completely dark room. All the lights are out, no light whatsoever. You could open up your shutter and take a 1-minute exposure. Well, the sensor's not going to record anything because there's no light present in the room. If you were to happen to fire your flash during the course of that 1-minute exposure, well, that flash comes and goes rather quickly, and it's the f-stop that's going to determine whether that flash was properly exposed, not the shutter speed, because the shutter speed's open for well over a minute when we're using this example. Well, let's talk about our next technique, which is bounce flash. Bounce flash is a marvelous way of working on interior locations to get a much softer, more pleasing light. And bounce flash is relatively easy to do. Now, a couple of things need to happen here. You need to have relatively low ceilings. I would say 12 to 15 feet at the max. Anything much higher than 12 to 15 feet is probably not going to make your bounce flash very practical. The other thing that you want to make sure is that your ceilings are a fairly neutral white. If you're bouncing off of a colorful ceiling, the lighting that you're going to get off of that ceiling or off of that surface is going to be present within your image. So we want to look for neutral walls or ceilings to bounce off of. And really the technique for bounce flash is as simple as shooting the flash straight forward, in that we have to know the flash to subject distance. Now, just like before, where we would divide, let's say, 10 feet into our guide number, 10 feet into 110 gives us f11. Well, in the case of bounce flash, we're not going to measure the distance between the flash and the subject necessarily. We're going to measure the distance from the flash to the subject as it travels up to the ceiling and back down. So we may be 10 feet away from the subject, but the distance that the flash travels up to the ceiling and back down may be 15 feet. So in that case, instead of using the 10 feet, we would divide 15 feet into our guide number to get the net result of F8. Now we're not quite done yet with bounce flash, because once you've determined that f-stop, the rule tells us that we need to open up at least one or two more additional stops to compensate for the lack of efficiency of the surface that the flash is coming off of. So you might want to experiment with this a little bit. An average white ceiling, try opening up your lens an additional stop, maybe two, to see which result you like best. So here's the deal. 15 feet up and back down is our distance. That gives us F8. By rule, we're going to want to open up one more stop to 5/6 or perhaps to F4 to really get a good exposure from our bounce flash. Now you can bounce off of a wall, you can bounce off of the ceiling, you can even turn the flash around behind you and bounce off the wall behind you. You want to make sure that the angle of the flash going up to the ceiling brings the flash back down onto your subject, because the laws of physics tell us that the light comes off of the surface at the angle that it hits. For example, let's again say we're 10 feet away from the subject. If I point the flash straight up, the light comes up and then comes straight back down. It does not travel that arc to reach to my subject. It's also possible to angle that flash so far forward that the light actually goes up to the ceiling and comes back down behind the subject. So it takes a little practice to find that right angle so that the light comes down across the front of the subject. Now we talked about this little device a little earlier, and the fact that just putting it on your flash does not change the softness of your light because it's not changing the size of the light source. Here's how you would really like to work this device. You use it in a bounce flash position. And the principle is that as the light's coming out of the top and bouncing off the ceiling and coming back down, some of that light is also pointing forward towards your subject to fill in what might be darker circles under the eyes or shadows that might occur because of certain hairstyles that would come over the forehead. By having this little bit of light coming forward, that fills in those shadows that might be created from the bounce flash. Your flash may also have a very similar device already built in, and in a way it's more efficient than this, but you simply pop up this little inside piece and the little plastic grid you can just push back down, but you have this little white bounce card that's built into the flash. And this is basically the same principle as what this device does. It points the flash straight up to use your bounce flash, but it directs some of that light forward to fill in those shadows. Here's a little trick here. It's real important that these get pressed all the way back in when you're done, because if you don't, you have no control over the settings on your flash. And I've seen a lot of cases where we've tried to get the zoom head back in position and we've tried to change some of those settings, and it's not possible because this card did not get tucked in all the way. So you might just double check that if every time you pull it out and push it back in, just make sure it goes all the way back in. Well, let's talk about another issue. Everything we've discussed so far is based upon photographing at 100 ISO. Well, there are times where you simply don't want to use 100 ISO. You might prefer to use 400 ISO. The perfect example for that for me is at a wedding. When I'm photographing at a wedding, I tend to use a lot of natural light, a lot of available light, a lot of ambient light that's present in the church and window light. And because I'm in such low light situations, I prefer to use 400 ISO. It would be very inconvenient to have to switch over to 100 ISO every time I need to use the flash, and then back to 400 ISO every time I'm going to use available light. So the fact of the matter is, I want to shoot the entire wedding, including the flash photographs, at 400 ISO. Well, if we followed the fundamental principles of our guide number, if we're changing ISOs, the guide number changes, and it would be sort of a pain to have to memorize another guide number and to have to go through all the mathematics of this in order to photograph at 400 ISO. So I've kind of developed a little shortcut, a little trick here that allows me to use my flash with exactly the same numbers even if I'm at 400 ISO. And the secret is in powering the flash down. If you think about the difference between 400 ISO and 100 ISO, the net result is really 2 stops. There's a 2-stop difference from 100 to 400. 400 being a lot more sensitive than 100 ISO. So if we use our flash set at full power while our camera is set at 400 ISO, it's simply going to overexpose. It's going to overexpose by 2 stops. What we want to do is make the flash power down by 2 stops so that when we're using it at 400 ISO, our guide numbers and our distances all remain the same. So here's what's going to happen. Again, think about this. There's a 2-stop difference between 400 and 100 ISO. So if full power represents 100 ISO, cutting the power down by 2 stops represents the same exposure for 400 ISO. So now then, a person standing 10 feet away and they're using 400 ISO, their exposure would really be f22. But if we're powering the flash down by 2 stops, now that exposure moves from 22 to 16 to 11. So the same 11 is the same 11 we had when we were using 100 ISO. The difference is our flash is powered down by 2 stops. So let's carry this one step further. Let's now take our flash and move it into 5 feet. Well, at 5 feet, we know the exposure was going to be f22. That's going to be the case here too. But if we want to power it down, let's say to f8, we simply keep cutting the power down by 3 stops. So the thing is, we're starting at 1/4 power rather than 1-to-1 power like we did at 100 ISO. So here we are at f22, 1/8 will take us down to f16, 1/16 will take us down to f11, and 1/32 will take us down to f8. So the numbers work exactly the same. It's just that with 400 ISO, we start at 1/4 power instead of 1-to-1. So let's review a couple of things. And I know you've heard this over and over throughout this DVD, but let's take a look at the checklist that we need when we start using our flash. First of all, remember that your camera needs to be set in manual mode and at 100 ISO. Your flash checklist includes having your flash set in manual mode, start with the ratio at 1-to-1, and your flash zoom head set to manual at the 35mm position. Now, if you happen to be using 400 ISO, that's okay. Set your camera to 400 ISO and start with your flash at 1/4 power at 1-to-4 for your 400 ISO exposures. And that way, all of your calculations and all of the guide numbers that we've learned would be exactly the same. I'd like to thank you for your investment in this DVD. I know if you'll watch it again and again, you'll pick up more and more every time you watch it, but the main thing is to go out and practice what you've learned. I'd also like to thank Matt Kozak, my producer and director, for helping me put this together, and I hope you found it well worth your time. Thanks again. If you'd like to learn more about my live workshops or the educational materials that I have, simply visit the website at www.photoproworkshops.com.